These are some of the most goofy and horrific war tactics in history, and they get crazier as the video goes on. One of the craziest tricks used in war at the time was when Persians used hundreds of cats to defeat the world's strongest army. You see, cats were considered as sacred in Egypt, which meant that if you hurt or killed a cat there, they would literally kill you over it. And that's exactly how the Persians were planning to win the war that they had with Egypt at the time. They had captured hundreds, if not thousands of cats, and when the battle between the two countries started, the Persians released all the cats into the battlefield like they were some kind of Pokemon army. And funnily enough, it actually worked. Soldiers were left confused and in chaos because they didn't want to hurt the cats. And those few who did were going to face an even bigger challenge coming up. This is because not only did the Persians dump the cats into the battlefield, they even strapped the cats to their shields and armor in hopes that the Egyptians would be scared to even hit the cats. And the stupid part is it worked. And this made them win the entire war, meaning Egypt was now under Persian control. And I know, that sounds insane. But here's an even more insane question for you. Have you ever tried to shoot someone with one of those laser pens in class? Well, turns out that's a war crime. In fact, laser weapons are so inhumane that they were banned from ever being used in combat. This is because there was no way to avoid an attack from a laser which would leave any soldier completely blinded, making them useless in war and permanently disabled. A high energy laser would be used to capture the soldier's attention before a second laser blinded everyone staring in its direction. Once hit with the laser, the soldiers would be disoriented, meaning they could easily walk into enemy fire or step on a landmine. The danger also comes from the fact that it doesn't take much to be blinded by a laser, meaning you could easily blind thousands of troops in a single strike, and you could easily overtake an enemy overnight. But even if you somehow managed to avoid turning into that block of Swiss cheese after being hit by the laser, your life would never be the same again. You would actually require assistance, and you would never be able to see your loved ones again. But those problems would only multiply if you were in contact with the phosgene gas. See, phosgene gas was one of the most insane and deadly things you could encounter on a battlefield, and many soldiers were terrified to come in contact with it. The gas is deadly for a bunch of reasons, including the fact that it has no smell or color, meaning it's completely undetectable. If a soldier breathes in this gas, they would have to start experiencing some extreme burning in the throat and eyes, since the gas literally just destroys your lungs. But by the time that this has started happening, it would already be too late to save you. And after this, you begin to vomit, and soon after you just keel over and die. If you were unfortunate enough to survive this, your skin would start peeling off as if you were severely burned anyway. Contact with the phosgene gas is always fatal, and it could take hours for troops to detect the usage of gas because of its lack of smell and color. That's why the soldiers were instructed to wear gas masks at the time, which caused soldiers to be even more stressed and scared about the trenches in general. They developed the gas in several ways, but most commonly they were shot at with artillery weapons somehow, and that was mainly because the shells would break open on impact. But sometimes they were also placed in an open field if the wind was blowing in the right direction. I know that sounds quite explosive or whatever, but it's kind of like how explosive the taste of spam is. Now, I know what you're thinking. What? How the fuck does a can of spam fit into this list? Well, did you know that they turned spam, the meat, into a war crime? You see, during the later years of the First World War, the Germans were starting to run out of food, which is why the Canadians were thinking of great ways to abuse this, and one idea that they came up with was so insane that doing so is now a war crime. They would start throwing cans of spam into the German trenches, and while they were scared at first, over time they would start to actually eat the spam. They also started trusting whoever was throwing the cans of the spam, usually gathering in areas around the group, and they just start begging for more. And at one point, it was like half the trench would come to see what was going on because there was little to no food going around at the time. But the Canadians didn't actually want to help out the Germans, of course. So when they knew their trust was won, they started turning the spam cans into grenades. And as corny as it sounds, they had an explosive taste. So the next time they threw the cans into the trench, they would explode whenever they were picked up. And with this, they were able to wipe out entire trenches with these one single can of spam. This tactic made the German soldiers feel hopeless since they lost the little bit of food they had, and it made them a lot angrier at the Canadians for doing such a horrible thing. And it's safe to say that this tactic is absolutely crazy, and it's no wonder that it became a war crime after the First World War. And I know, spam tastes horrifically poisonous, but some of the biological forts were way more poisonous. You see, biological warfare is even more deadly and inhumane than chemical warfare, since it can wipe out entire cities of people if it's used on them. And a really popular example of biological warfare is from the smallpox blankets. It's exactly what it sounds like, blankets on other pieces of clothing, and they're just infected with smallpox. And this is usually done to weaken a fortress of armies. It is either done by launching the blankets into enemy territories using cannons, or by handing it to the enemy officers disguised as a gift. It would have roughly the same effect as sneezing on an unvaccinated kid, since it would leave them completely sick or sometimes even dead. The funniest part is that it actually worked. For example, Fort Pitt in 1763. It was a conflict between Native American tribes and the British, who owned Fort Pitt for the most of the time. The fort was stormed by the Americans, and they were getting dangerously close to it, so the British had to think of ways to keep keep them out without stabbing them by hand, which is where they came up with the idea of smallpox. The plan was to hand out Indian blankets and handkerchiefs borrowed from smallpox hospitals during peace negotiations in order to weaken the army, and it actually worked. The British managed to defeat the four, and the Indians now had a whole different problem to deal with, kind of like a bigger problem like kamikaze was. You see, most people already know about kamikaze planes that crashed into allied boats, but did you know there's a whole different group of kamikaze stretching so far that they would even make literal human anti-ship mines that just sat at the bottom of the ocean? And I know, it sounds very weird, but these three groups of kamikaze will actually terrify you. Take for example the lunge mines. This was just a long stick with a mine slapped on top of it, with the entire purpose for the mine to have a soldier just run up to a tank, remove the safety pin, and just throw yourself at an enemy tank like it's no tomorrow. Well, that's probably because there would be no tomorrow, but that's because in most cases the person holding the mine on the stick would instantly die from the explosion. And what's worse is it wouldn't even fully take out the tank, it would just make an opening in the side of it or something. This technique was often used during the Second World War, but things got a lot more extreme when the Japanese realized that the ocean also exists. We're missing out on an entire market of suicide bombers here. I mean, look, there's a perfectly good ocean we can use. And just like that, the suicide divers were born. These guys' jobs were literally to suit up in a diving kit, grab a mine on a piece of bamboo, and get to work. They would usually sit in water for up to 10 hours waiting for an enemy ship to arrive. And once they did, well, they'd just point the stick at the hull of a ship and wait for it to crash into it. The Japanese bought like 8,000 of these suits, but only 1,200 or so soldiers were trained enough to actually use them. Though I don't see how it takes much training to poke a stick at a boat, but it might be me. This technique was kind of successful as they managed to damage several US ships during the invasion of Japan, but luckily they didn't cost nearly as much as the next form of kamikaze. And before we continue, I just want to say, could you please subscribe? It means so much, and since you're already watching this far into the video, it means you like it most likely. So if you enjoyed, please subscribe. Kaizen were small torpedoes operated by people on board, filled with explosives that were designed to crash into enemy ships. If you were on the right course to hit an enemy ship, you would lock controls and wait for the right moment to explode it. Most of the times these attacks wouldn't work since the ship would be gone by the time the submarine got to it. And in total over 500 of these things were made, but only like 1 or 2 times where they actually worked and took ships down. So you can imagine hearing that you'd be assigned to get inside a torpedo and crash yourself into an enemy ship. I'd be terrified. Kind of like how terrified I would be if I was dead and a military captain at the same time? What? How does that work? I know, it just sounds weird, but not many people have changed the course of World War after months of dying. But one dead homeless guy actually somehow led the Allies to win the Second World War without even being alive, or even being involved at all. During World War II, the Allies desperately needed to win an upcoming invasion of Sicily, but they knew that the Germans were defending that area really well, which is why they came up with the idea to gaslight the Nazis into thinking they were invading Greece and Sardinia. Now, obviously this is a really difficult thing to do, as the Germans are surely smart enough to see enough through lies of the Allies, so obviously they needed an insanely good plan. And they came up with a plan that was very simple, but required a lot of luck to pull off. The first step of the plan was to find a body that they could drop in the Germans. Lucky for them, they found a homeless guy called Gillander, who was found off the street after chugging some rat poison. Now it was time to turn good old Gillander into one of the most esteemed majors that the army had to offer. The goal was to strap some fake invasion plans to Gillen's body and ditch him somewhere in the sea, with the hopes that he would be found by the Germans on the beach, so they had all the fake plans. So they tossed Gillen, now the Major of the Royal Marines, into the ocean right outside Spain, complete with fake photos of his family, some letters to his father, and some fake invasion plans. And luckily, the Germans found those plans, and the Allies acted like they really wanted those documents back, since they were very classified. But the Germans said, "Finders keepers," and actually sent a huge part of their army to defend Greece and Sardinia, leaving Sicily completely free for the Allies to just take over. And securing Sicily was really important for the invasion of Italy and Europe, so it's crazy to think about how it would have actually gone without our beloved Gillander. Such a valiant soldier. Gone too soon. But what I'm about to tell you is even crazier. Did you know that people with OCD had a higher chance of dying during the Second World War? I know, it sounds stupid, but the Germans left a bunch of really weird random traps around, like for example, a crooked painting. Yep, a painting. They would intentionally tilt paintings and make it so if soldiers tried to correct them, they would instantly be blown up by explosives. And it wasn't just paintings they turned into explosives. The British literally turned rats into walking, ticking time bombs. They did this because the Germans always used to burn rats in their ovens in order to prevent diseases from spreading. But if the suicide bomber rats were chucked into the furnace, it would cause them to explode and destroy everything around them. Never thought suicide rats would be a thing. But what Dennis Delmer did was way worse. You see, not many people have convinced an entire troop of enemy soldiers to fake being sick in order to not have to go to war. But Dennis, he somehow did. Dennis Delmer's tactics are so funny that he deserves his own spot in this list. You see, Dennis was someone that made propaganda during World War II, and he did quite a lot of other stuff. Like for example, making food stamps that were even higher quality than the actual ones, which made the real thing look like counterfeits. But his greatest work is probably how he convinced thousands of soldiers to fake illness to make Germany lose battles. Dennis would make books of instructions of how to fake illness and spread them as deep into Germany as he possibly could, to convince the German troops to possibly not fight for their country. And he said it would be a win-win situation if they did have to fight, since officers now wouldn't believe that people were actually sick, which also meant that real sick soldiers would actually be sent back to fight, which would mean entire troops of soldiers somehow got sick and couldn't fight. No sick days, I guess, but it would be made way worse if you had to fight a bunch of balloons like a birthday party. Yeah, I'm not even joking either. You see, during World War II, the Allies wanted to convince the Germans that D-Day was happening at a different point. They did this by setting up an entire army of fake inflatable planes, tanks, trucks, and even a full outpost of communications giving fake orders to troops in hopes that the Germans would believe the lies. The trick worked so well that the Germans kept troops at the fake invasion site for weeks, even while the Normandy invasion was happening at the same time. This trick is still being used today, like for example in Ukraine at the moment, where they've even put heat generators in to give the fake tanks a correct heat signature. But hey, if you like this video, make sure to click the one on screen. YouTube thinks you'll like it. We do too, it's a pretty good video. Right, bye bye.